Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into something really counterintuitive, actually. A historical puzzle. Imagine an inheritance law where it's not the eldest son who gets everything, but the youngest. Sounds odd, right?
It really does. It flips our usual assumptions completely.
And that's just the start. Our whole exploration today comes straight from a fantastic source, part 2, chapter 2 of Sir James George Frazer's huge work, Folklore in the Old Testament.
Yeah, a really foundational text for this kind of study.
So our mission is to tackle two big, often misunderstood areas from Frazer's work. First, this custom of ultimogeniture, that's the fancy term for the youngest inheriting.
Junior right, sometimes called.
Right, junior right. And second, we're diving into that notorious and, well, maybe largely mythical right of the first night, the jus primae noctis.
Yeah, yes, that one definitely captures the imagination, for all the wrong reasons, perhaps.
Exactly. So let's kick off with this idea of the youngest inheriting. Where did Frazer find this custom, and what did he make of it?
Well, what's immediately striking is how Frazer uses ultimogeniture, this idea of the youngest son, or sometimes daughter, inheriting the main property to explain biblical stories that seem a bit puzzling otherwise.
Like Jacob and Esau, maybe?
Precisely. Stories like that. He suggests later historians might have just missed the context because they weren't familiar with this custom being so widespread back then. It's like finding a key piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so it helps make sense of ancient texts, but where was this actually practiced? Was it common in Europe, for instance?
Oh, definitely. Frazer found clear examples. In England, there was something called Borough English.
Borough English.
Yeah, an old custom, still around in places like Nottingham, even when Frazer was writing. And it was the direct opposite of the more common law approach, which they sometimes called Borough French, where the eldest inherited.
Huh. So why? Why the youngest in Borough English? Was there a reason?
Well, the thinking, especially from legal historians like Professor Maitland, linked it to something called servile tenure, basically peasants holding land from a lord. Maitland's theory was pretty practical. He argued the youngest child was simply the most likely to still be at home, living with the parents, when the father died.
Ah, because the older ones would have already moved out.
Exactly. They'd have left to set up their own households.
Okay.
So the youngest was there to take over the farm, the hearth. And importantly, it wasn't always the son. It could be the youngest daughter or even the youngest sister or aunt if there were no direct children.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. A very human solution. So not just an odd English thing, then.
Not at all. Frazer traces it across Europe. In Celtic areas like Wales, ancient laws gave the youngest son the main homestead. The buildings, key tools, thing considered essential and couldn't be sold off.
Right.
Same kind of thing in the Shetland Islands. Youngest child, boy or girl, got the house. Then you look at France, places like Brittany, Picardy. They had terms like mainet.
Mainet.
Yeah, or Madelstad. Again, the youngest child, son or daughter, got special rights to certain types of land tenure, often linked, like in England, to that servile status. And it tended to fade as feudal lords pushed back against it.
Interesting. So it's tied to social status, too.
Often, yes. You see it in Friesland, too, with their 𝘂𝗪𝗪𝗃𝗃 youngest son inherits the indivisible family plot. And in Germany, Frazer noted that even when modern laws favored splitting inheritance or giving it to the eldest, peasant communities often clung really strongly to the tradition of the youngest son getting the whole farm, undivided. The other siblings just accepted it.
Wow, so culture trumped law in practice.
It often did, yeah. And Russia provides another really clear example. Among Russian peasants, especially in the south and west, this junior right was very common.
Why there? Same reason.
Pretty much the same logic. Elder sons usually split off, formed their own households, maybe got a plot of land elsewhere. The youngest son stayed. There was this idea an ethnologist called 𝘂𝗪𝗪𝗃𝗃 noted that the youngest never severs from the father's root.
That's quite poetic.
Isn't it? And it came with duties, like caring for elderly parents. But Frazer stresses this was very much a peasant custom in Russia. You didn't find it among the nobility or other classes. Similar patterns pop up in Hungary. Among the northern chuds, youngest gets the house, maybe pays some compensation to the others.
Okay, so a really widespread pattern across Europe, especially among agricultural communities. Let's hop over to Asia. Does the pattern hold? Does it maybe get clearer there?
It really does. Frazer draws strong connections between social habits and inheritance customs there. Among Turkic and Mongol peoples, for instance, the youngest son was often called the guardian of the hearth.
Otsakin.
Exactly, Otsakin or Tekin. He inherited the permanent family land, the core property, while the older brothers might divide up the herds, the movable stuff. Though Frazer does mention 𝘂𝗶𝗵𝗺𝗺 found some variations or counter-evidence among Mongols, so it wasn't monolithic.
Right, always exceptions. But this next example you mentioned from the outline, the 𝘂𝗫𝗍𝗄 of Assam, sounds absolutely crucial.
It really is a fantastic case study. The 𝘱𝗫𝗄𝗧 were a Mongoloid tribe practicing 𝘂𝗂𝗍𝗫, basically, slash-and-burn agriculture. They moved around.
So no permanent land ownership.
Right. Not even for chiefs. So what happened was, when a chief's elder sons got married, they'd take some followers and go off to found a new village. The youngest son, staying with the father, would then inherit the original village and the chief's property.
Okay, follows the pattern, but what's the clincher?
The clincher is that Frazer notes this custom was actively changing when observers were studying them. Villages were getting smaller, maybe due to external pressures, and there weren't enough spare households for elder sons to easily start new villages anymore.
So what happened to the inheritance?
It was shifting towards primogeniture, the eldest son inheriting, because the underlying reason for ultimogeniture, the elder son's leaving, was disappearing.
Wow, that's like watching evolution in action. It perfectly supports the idea that ultimogeniture is about who stays home.
Exactly. It's powerful confirmation. And you see variations elsewhere in Assam. The 𝘂𝗵𝗵𝗺𝗺, for example, they had settled, terraced farming, permanent fields. Their inheritance reflected that more settled life, though some ultimogeniture elements remained. Other Naga tribes varied too, depending on their specific settlement patterns.
And the Kachins, they sounded complicated.
Yeah, the Kachins straddling China and Burma had both migratory and settled groups, sometimes described as mixing primogeniture and ultimogeniture. But again, often the youngest son ended up with the house. It reinforces that link. How you use the land influences how you pass it on.
Makes sense. Any others in Asia reinforcing this?
Sure. The Shans in Yunnan, China youngest son gets the land. Older brothers often went into trade or emigrated. The Chins in Burma youngest son is the heir, explicitly tied to caring for parents. And like the 𝘱𝗫𝗍𝗄, Frazer notes reports that this custom was also starting to shift towards primogeniture in some Chin groups, like the Hakka Chins.
Okay, the core logic seems really solid. Youngest stays, youngest inherits the base. But you mentioned a twist earlier. Sometimes the youngest daughter inherits. How does that work?
Yes. This is where we see social structure directly shaping the custom. Among the 𝘂𝗶𝗵𝗺𝗺𝘀, also in Assam, it's the youngest daughter who is the main heir.
Why the daughter?
Because these societies are what anthropologists call motherkin, or matrilineal. Descent, name, property. It all passes through the female line.
Okay.
And the practical reason mirrors the patrilineal cases, just flipped.
Yeah.
In these societies, daughters typically stay in their mother's house their whole lives. Sons, when they marry, go to live with their wives' families.
So the women are the permanent residents of the household.
Precisely. Making the youngest daughter the natural heir to the ancestral home. It's the same principle who stays inherits, but applied within a different kinship system. Frazer points out they're likely of Mongolian origin, interestingly, though the Qazi language itself is distinct.
That's a brilliant illustration of how the underlying logic adapts. Any final examples before we summarize ultimogeniture?
Just briefly, Frazer mentions the 𝘂𝗵𝗵𝗺𝗃 on the Burma-Bengal border. Youngest son gets everything. And the 𝘱𝗳𝗄𝗃, or 𝘯𝘂𝗽𝗃 in Bengal. Youngest male is the heir. Their stated reason was interesting. They felt the youngest was less able to fend for himself after the parents died because the older brothers had already received help setting up their own places.
A sort of compensatory logic.
Kind of. And interestingly, among the host chiefs, public authority might go to the eldest son, but the chief's private property went to the youngest. We also see bits of ultimogeniture among the Bhils in central India. The Bodegas in southern India always link back to elder sons leaving home.
Okay, so pulling all of Frazer's examples together, the big picture on ultimogeniture is what?
The big picture, overwhelmingly, is that it's a practical adaptation. It arises most often in situations where elder children typically move away from the parental home to start their own lives, leaving the youngest son or daughter, depending on the kinship system, as the one remaining to inherit the original homestead, and often the duty of caring for aging parents. It's economics and family structure shaping law.
Right. Very clear. Okay, let's switch gears completely now to the other major topic from this chapter. The notorious, infamous, just prima noctis, the right of the first night.
Ah, yes, the lurid tale.
The common story, the one everyone sort of knows, is that some feudal lord, maybe even a bishop or priest, had the legal right to sleep with the tenant's bride on her wedding night before the husband could. It sounds utterly awful.
It does. And it's a story that has had incredible staying power in popular culture. But here's the thing. According to Frazer's analysis and the consensus of serious legal historians he cites, It's basically a myth.
A complete myth, no basis in reality.
Well, not in the way it's usually understood. Frazer calls it a monstrous fable. He looks first at England, where some older writers tried to connect it back to Borough English, remember?
Yes, yeah, the youngest inheriting.
They speculated. Maybe the eldest was disinherited because his paternity was doubtful due to the Lord exercising this right. But Frazer points out that the top legal historians, Blackstone, Maitland, Vinogradov, Pollock, they are absolutely unanimous. There is zero credible evidence that such a right ever existed in England. None.
So what was the 𝘂𝗫 payment then? Wasn't that involved?
Good point. That's where the confusion comes in. 𝘂𝗫𝗆𝗺𝘁𝗃 was a real thing, but it was simply a fine paid by a tenant, usually unfree and servile tenure, to his lord when the tenant's daughter got married.
Why pay to lord?
Because the lord was losing her labor, her services. It was compensation for that economic loss. It had absolutely nothing to do with buying off some sexual right. It was a marker of low social status, sure, but it wasn't what the fable claimed.
Okay, so just a feudal tax, basically, that got twisted into something sinister. What about Scotland? I've definitely heard the story set there.
You have, and even the great Blackstone repeated the claim for Scotland. The story comes from a much later writer, 𝘂𝗵𝗵𝗺𝗺, writing in 1527. He tells this tale of a wicked, ancient King Evenus III who supposedly enacted this law.
Evenus III. Sounds a bit convenient.
Exactly. Frazer points out King Evenus III is entirely mythical, a legendary figure, not historical. So his laws are equally fabulous, just stories. Bowies claimed this awful right was later abolished by the real King Malcolm Canmore around the 11th century and replaced by a payment, the marchetta.
Which was just the same as the English 𝘂𝗫, presumably.
Precisely. It was the same kind of feudal due, a payment for marriage, likely for loss of services. No evidence points to some infamous original involving the lord and the bride. Later Scottish writers just copied 𝘂𝗶𝗺ći's fable without checking.
It's amazing how a story, once written down, just gets repeated and accepted. Did this happen elsewhere in Europe, too?
Same pattern. Frazer notes that similar fines and payments existed on the continent, and they too were misinterpreted by later writers as being payments to avoid this mythical right. But thorough searches of historical archives, they come up empty. No actual law, no record of this right being exercised.
So, if the lord having the right of the first night is a fable, was there any real custom that might have been confused with it? Did the term 𝘃𝗵𝗺 noctis actually refer to something real?
Yes, and this is where Frazer's research gets really fascinating, I think. He argues the fable got accidentally reinforced by mixing it up with a completely different custom, one that was actually ecclesiastical, related to the church.
A church custom, what was that?
The actual practice, sometimes historically referred to, though maybe not always by that exact Latin term, concerned the husband's right to sleep with his own wife on the wedding night. Or rather, the expectation that he shouldn't, at least not immediately.
Wait, the husband shouldn't sleep with his wife on the wedding night. Why ever not?
Out of religious piety, basically. The early Christian church taught that couples should observe a period of continence abstinence for usually 1, 2, or 3 nights after the wedding ceremony itself.
As a sign of respect.
Yes, out of reverence for the sacrament, for the blessing they'd received. You see this recommended in church councils, like the Fourth Council of Carthage, even in Charlemagne's laws. It became associated with the story of Tobias from the apocryphal book of Tobit.
Tobias, remind me of that story.
In the book, Sarah's first 7 husbands were all killed on their wedding night by a jealous demon, Asmodeus. Her 8th husband, Tobias, is advised by the archangel Raphael to spend the first 3 nights in prayer with Sarah, abstaining from intercourse and burning fish parts to drive the demon away. He does, and survives.
Okay, so the Tobias nights meant abstinence to ward off evil or show piety.
Exactly. And Frazer suggests this part of the Tobit story might even be a later addition, specifically to encourage this practice of pious continence. Now, the crucial part for the 𝘃𝗵𝗺𝗺𝗃 noctis confusion is this. Sometimes, the church would grant a dispensation from these Tobias nights.
You could get permission to consummate your marriage sooner.
Yes, but often you had to pay a fee to the church, to the bishop usually, for this dispensation.
Ah, a fee paid to a church official regarding the first night.
Precisely. Frazer gives a concrete example. A lawsuit in 1409 involving the Bishop of Amiens in France. The bishop was demanding a fee from newly married couples for a license to sleep together on the first night. If they didn't pay, they had to abstain for 3 nights.
So that's the payment people might have later misunderstood.
That seems to be a major source of the confusion. People hear about a fee paid to a superior concerning the wedding night, and they conflate this ecclesiastical fee for avoiding abstinence with the fictional feudal lord's right. Incidentally, the court ruled against the Bishop of Amiens, saying husbands didn't need to pay for that right.
That's a huge difference. One is a church fee related to piety, the other is a fabricated feudal violation. Was this idea of delaying consummation purely a Christian thing, though?
Not at all. And this is another key point Frazer makes. This practice of waiting a few nights, or sometimes longer, is far older and more widespread than Christianity. He found examples everywhere.
Like where?
Vedic India, for instance. Ancient Hindu texts, the Grihya Sutras, often mandated 3 nights of continence after marriage. Specific rules: sleeping on the ground, eating certain foods, staying separate. Sometimes it was longer, 6 nights, 12, even a year, believed to result in more virtuous children.
So the church didn't invent it, they adopted it.
It certainly looks that way. Frazer gives tons of examples from various tribes across Asia, Assam, Burma, the Mully region, even Australia. Customs of waiting days, weeks, sometimes months. The reasons given varied, sometimes shame or decency, sometimes explicitly to avoid sickness caused by evil spirits thought to be attracted to newlyweds.
Evil spirits again, like the Tobias story.
Exactly. The Dayaks of Borneo, Javanese customs, they often involved measures to placate or avoid spirits. Similar things in Africa among various American Indian tribes. Periods of abstinence linked to spiritual well-being or showing the marriage wasn't just about lust.
And you mentioned bridesmaids and groomsmen earlier.
Yes. Frazer points out that in many cultures, the role of these attendants was, in part, specifically to prevent the couple from consummating the marriage too quickly, to ensure the period of abstinence was observed.
That completely changes how you think about those roles.
Doesn't it? So the Tobias Nights custom in Christianity looks much more like the church absorbing a very widespread, ancient pagan practice, this fear of supernatural danger around newlyweds, and giving it a Christian explanation and framework. The demon Asmodeus in the Tobias story fits perfectly with this global pattern of fearing spirits jealous of marital happiness.
So the fear of demons seems a much more likely origin for these wedding night customs than any imaginary right of lords.
That's certainly the thrust of Frazer's argument. The 𝘂𝗶𝗵𝗺𝗪𝘮 fable likely arose from confusing the Merchet fines with the Tobias night dispensation fees, perhaps fueled by anti-clerical or anti-feudal sentiments later on.
Okay, one last loose end. Before we wrap up, Frazer briefly touches on another theory for ultimogeniture related to polygamy.
Ah, yes. The idea that in polygamous families, maybe the husband preferred his youngest wife, and so her son, often the youngest son overall, would be favored in inheritance.
Does Frazer find any evidence for that?
No, he actually argues strongly against it. His research, especially looking at African societies but also elsewhere, showed the opposite was usually true. In most polygamous cultures, the first wife married holds the highest rank and status.
And her children.
And it's almost always her eldest son who is the principal heir, especially for any titles or positions of authority. So Frazer concludes that this polygamy theory finds basically no support in the actual ethnographic evidence. The youngest stays home explanation remains much stronger.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize all this. We've gone through Frazer's deep dive into these two fascinating and often confused customs. What are the main takeaways?
Well, I think there are 2 really big ones. First, ultimogeniture, the youngest inheriting, is not just some weird anomaly. It's a real, logical, and surprisingly widespread custom, deeply tied to the practicalities of family structure and economics specifically. Who stays in the parental home when elder siblings leave?
Right, it's adaptive.
Exactly. And second, the popular conception of jus prima noctis, the Lord's right to the bride's first night, is almost certainly, as Frazer calls it, a monstrous fable. A baseless calumny.
Built on misunderstandings.
Right. Built on confusing mundane feudal fines, the Merchet, with unrelated church fees for dispensation from the Tobias Nights custom, a custom itself rooted in ancient widespread fears about supernatural danger around marriage. The lurid story just isn't supported by historical evidence.
It's incredible, isn't it, how a complete fabrication, a misunderstanding, can take root and persist for centuries as accepted history. Frazer's work really highlights that process of needing to rigorously examine sources and peel back the layers of folklore.
It really does. It shows how easily ignorance, prejudice, and just confusing different ideas can create these powerful, lasting myths.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe. If this fable of jus prima noctis could circulate so widely and for so long, despite having no real basis, what other things that we accept as historical fact today might actually be, well, similar monstrous fables? How can we use this kind of critical approach, like Frazer's, to question the stories we tell ourselves now?
It's a really potent question to leave listeners with.
Indeed. Well, this has been a fascinating journey through just one chapter of Frazer's massive work. We hope this deep dive into ultimogeniture and the myth of just Praminoctus has given you plenty to think about. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.